Hello, and welcome to The Dark Dive, the podcast that delves into the depths of the dark web. My name is Aidan Murphy, and I'll be your host as each episode we look at a different aspect of the dark web, the part of the internet that is intentionally obscured. In the podcast feed, you'll find episodes on how the dark web works, the criminal activity that takes place on hacking forums and dark web marketplaces, and how security professionals and law enforcement can tackle it. In this episode, we're going to focus specifically on ransomware, one of the most prevalent cybersecurity threats. We'll be discussing how ransomware groups use the dark web, why they use it, and the opportunity this creates for security professionals that are looking to get the upper hand on cyber criminals. Joining me to discuss this topic are two colleagues of Lethal Cunning, Jim Simpson, Director of Threat Intelligence at Searchlight Cyber. Hello, Jim.
How are we doing? Does that mean that I'm like the master lethal cunning person?
Well, no, we're just going in random order, Jim.
Oh, right, okay. Because I was going to say that's more loose bag than mine.
And Louise Ferrett, Senior Threat Intelligence Analyst at Searchlight Cyber. Hello, Louise.
Hi, Aidan.
How's it going?
Yeah, not bad. You know, lethal, cunning, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, day to day. Great. So before we jump into what is a pretty big topic, and we've got a lot to talk about, can I just get each of you to do a really quick introduction to yourself for our listeners? So I'll start with you, Jim.
So I'm Jim Simpson. I'm Director of Threat Intelligence at Searchlight Cyber. I'm also a SANS certified instructor candidate teaching the Cyber Threat Intel course for SANS. That's 578. I enjoy looking into the threats and the intelligence we can take from the dark web. Previous to this, I was Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence at BlackBerry Silence as well. So I have background from the malware side of things and from the dark web side of things. So I can hopefully bring a bit of perspective on the whole ecosystem as it exists and what that means for security professionals.
Brilliant. Louise?
I'm Louise Ferrett. I'm Senior Threat Intelligence Analyst here at Searchlight. I tend to work mainly on our data collection sort of operations, as well as ensuring data consistency and integrity, and also a lot of stuff on ransomware, which helps with this episode. And yeah, just sort of poking around on the dark web and seeing what's interesting there.
Being an all-round cunning.
Yeah,
exactly.
We're speaking to the right person. Definitely poking around the dark web is what we're going to be talking about. Awesome. So we obviously have a very intelligent and informed listenership. We don't need to go into too much detail for them, but I do think just to ensure we're on the right page as we start off, it is worth just defining what we mean by ransomware. Ransomware is a big topic. It's talked about in the news a lot, but it has changed. And we just want to make sure that everybody is following. So I don't know, maybe I can call on you, Jim, to just give like a very, very quick Director of Threat Intelligence overview of what ransomware is.
Yeah, for sure. I was all ready to go with like a whole long explanation. You told me to be quick. So this will be the cut down version, the abridged version. The ransomware as we see it today isn't how it's always been. The first real case we can point to of this was back in 1989. A guy called Dr. Joseph Pop created what was known as the AIDS ransomware. Back in the 80s, late 80s, the AIDS epidemic was spreading and there were a bunch of people doing research on it. Dr. Joseph Pop created some software that he shipped around to all these different research places on floppy disk. I don't know if many of our newer listeners or younger listeners remember what a floppy disk was, but these was like the 3.5-inch floppy disks. It implemented a counter so that, basically people would start using the software and think, oh, this is brilliant. It's been shipped for free, a load of features inside of it. It would count the number of reboots on the system, and when the reboots hit 90, it would lock the system. It would then prompt you with a reminder that this was actually paid for software and you had not paid your license fee. You had to mail a check in the post to a PO box, I think it was in Panama somewhere, in order to get your system unlocked. So ransomware has been around for a long time. The idea of ransomware has been around for a long time. The reason why it's so prevalent nowadays is maybe not as obvious. If you are a big ransomware group, you don't want people mailing checks around the world. They can get stopped. The banking sector is very good at spotting these transactions and picking up on these transactions and ultimately putting names to faces for this kind of stuff. So one of the biggest things that we need to look at in the mix of attributes that makes ransomware function today is the rise of cryptocurrency. So back in the 2010s, crypto obviously started to emerge. And where we start to think of ransomware today, like the early part of ransomware back then was this type of crypto locker thing, which usually went after people at home encrypting photos. You wanted to get your photos back because it's got a load of memories in there, and they would charge you a single Bitcoin to recover that, which you might gasp in shock that you would have to pay for a Bitcoin with it. Bitcoin back then was worth about $300, so it was nowhere near as big a thing. Which points to another thing. The guys can make an awful lot of money off it, not just by extorting crypto, but the rise in crypto and the fluctuations in the crypto market means that if they managed to get hold of 10 Bitcoin 10 years ago, then they'd be massively rich by now, just holding onto that Bitcoin. There's also been the rise in tooling that helps facilitate this. There are both offensive security tools, so tools that are created by legit companies to help pen testers do things, get out there and get leaked. One of the most well-known ones is Cobalt Strike. You also have the proliferation of techniques from multiple leaks over the years, Vault 7 leaks, the hacking team leaks, a whole bunch of different cases where sophisticated methodologies have been leaked to the criminals so that they can use them. And you have the willingness of people to pay. So you mix all those three things together, the crypto, the tooling, and the willingness of people to pay, and you end up with a viable market to go after if you're a ransomware operator. You can then move it on to the likes of the ransomware as a service model where you have affiliates. So someone will create the ransomware. You can then loan that ransomware binary to go and do your ransomware things. You as the affiliate, you as the person using it, you don't have to develop your own capability, but you are implementing it. You will take a percentage of the cut, and the creator of the ransomware will take a smaller percentage. So it's a way that they can scale, as in the developers and managers of it can scale their business by bringing in sort of subcontractors to do the hands-on work. And then you've moved into sort of like that double extortion. The idea early on was we are going to hold your files to ransom and you have to pay us to get those decryption keys back. They've then moved on to double and triple extortion. Double meaning we are going to ransom your files, but then we will also steal them and threaten to leak them, being double extortion. Triple extortion is they will do both of those things, and then on top they will go and talk to your customers and say this is how bad their security is. So they're trying to find ways to keep putting the pressure on people to keep paying. So if there is no willingness to pay, they will find other ways to make you feel like you have to.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I guess just pulling on that last point. So even though obviously the methods have moved on from floppy disks and checks, thanks for bringing those up. That's definitely alienated Gen Z. Even though the methods have moved on, like the technology, both on kind of the finance and I guess the hacking side have moved on considerably, the same principle still applies. It's encryption software that stops you getting what you want. Obviously the double extortion, triple extortion thing you can get onto in a second. But still the core of what ransomware is I'm stopping you using your system how you would like to use it, and you have to pay me money in order to get it back. Is that fair enough to say?
Pretty much, yeah. I'm going to find a point of pain within your organization, and I'm going to leverage that point of pain for my financial gain. It keeps evolving as things change. It keeps changing new methods and ways of doing it. And right now we're seeing double, triple extortion, but expect that to change. As people refuse to pay for those reasons, they will try and find another way to do it. There's a lot of money to be made.
I'm going to jump on double and triple extortion in just 1 second, but before we get there, so in that timeline, I guess, between floppy disks and now, in my mind, and this is probably just says more about when I started working in cybersecurity, 2017 was kind of a bit of an inflection point because of the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks. Is that fair enough to say? That's for me, that's when ransomware went from kind of like a niche issue, or maybe not as kind of mainstream as other cybersecurity issues at the time, and became the dominant issue. Is that how you see things?
I think with those two cases, what you had was the scale of the issue right then was represented. They were single attacks that impacted a huge number of people. It kind of also overlaps with that offensive security tooling and the leaks we're talking about as well. And WannaCry leveraged Eternal Blue, which was an exploit developed by NSA, and it was leaked as part of the Vault 7 leaks. There was a patch available. It points to people need to patch, and if you don't patch, you can get hit by these things. But because it was so vast and so impactful, like it was hitting the NHS, the NotPetya stuff where it was impacting global companies who interacted with Ukraine and had to rely on using that Ukrainian tax software, it was the sheer number, the sheer volume of people, the sheer volume of victims that captured the imagination of people. And like, this is serious. If it's wormable, like WannaCry and NotPetya are, then you don't need human operators to go spreading it. It will spread itself. It's written into the code to try and leverage those exploits elsewhere. And I think that all ties back together to your point of this is when it really hit the media and the mainstream, because it was such this point of imagination was like triggered as like, oh no, the cyber threats are really here, and it's going to affect people, not just us cybersecurity nerds sat in different organizations around the world crying about it and saying, look, this is a real problem. Everyone was impacted, and yeah, it hits the mainstream news.
The problem with that as well is that it's not just the victims or potential victims that hear about it, it's also the criminals, and they get some ideas too. At which point I might draw on Louise's knowledge, because these, I guess the other difference is WannaCry and NotPetya, I guess as you alluded to, Jim, they were nation-backed, like very, very clearly nation-backed attacks. But Louise, is it fair to say that the groups that we track, at least, we're talking about more kind of like financially motivated commercial operations than departments working in with the Russian security services?
Yeah, broadly. When you said nation back there, although it is very similar, I know Jim is cringing internally because he recently made a big old point about how it should be state backed, not nation state.
That's a fair point. Well, I mean, I guess for our listeners, what is the distinction, Jim?
So state-backed delineates a territory. So where you have borders involved, that's a state. A nation is another way to look at a community of peoples. They revolve around a single ideology, or they say a single religion or single sense of community, right? So if you have a nation state, it's a single state territory that has this same ideology or religious belief or culture or historic meaning behind it, which means everyone coalesces around that same thing. You can't look at the UK and say we're a nation state, because we aren't. We're like fractured all over the place, and there's loads of little communities within the UK, so we're not a nation state. So every time someone says nation, it's sort of like have a little twitch, a little OCD thing goes on. But yeah,
I love it. We've all learned something today. That's good.
State backed is always the way to go.
Getting into anthropology as well. I bet you didn't realize how versatile we were.
We're going to really have to think about how we categorize this podcast, but that's cool. Okay, sorry, Louise. So state-backed. So what I'm asking is the kind of profile we see of the groups now, financially motivated. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, that's definitely fair to say. With some of the record-breaking ransoms that have been sort of demanded in recent years, I think Colonial Pipeline was a pretty astonishing one. Money is the name of the game for sure. I mean, the clue is in the title as well of ransomware. They're after ransom payments. Broadly speaking, I think the kind of conventional wisdom is that yes, these actors are not under the direct control of any one state. There is an argument, I suppose, especially with the kind of Russian cybercrime community, that it's sort of tolerated rather than being instructed, but it's sort of a blind eye is turned to it, providing that you don't hit any Russian companies or companies in Russia's kind of periphery, so like ex-Soviet states. I think it's the Commonwealth of Independent States, and you do see that quite often when ransomware kind of as a service operators are promoting their product. They do stipulate that it can't be used to attack these specific countries. So that sort of lends a bit of legitimacy to that argument. I suppose also the sort of secondary kind of impact of ransomware is that it is very disruptive to the functioning of businesses and supply chains, which could be beneficial from a sort of state point of view. But I think there's probably easier ways to do it than this kind of like stratified, all these different groups sort of vying for the biggest catch. So yeah, I think characterizing it as primarily a financially motivated criminal sort of enterprise is accurate.
There was a case, wasn't there, of a ransomware group that was targeting Ukrainian infrastructure and not offering a decryptor, which suggested that it was very much about disruption rather than find that is, and off the top of my head, I can't remember which group it was.
The overall categorization of those can be referred to as wipers rather than ransomware.
Yeah,
the idea is
more like a wiper.
This might be a good point to ask a question that I imagine a lot of the audience will have, which is what kind of geographical placement, I guess, we're talking about when we talk about ransomware groups. So there is definitely a perception. I mean, I think a lot of people would associate Russia with ransomware. Whether that's correct or incorrect, I'm not sure. But I guess from our experience, is it fair to categorize it that way? Are there groups outside of Russia, or is it just too hard to say or attribute it in that way?
So I'm going to hedge my bets here and say we never really know for sure, where these groups are originating from, especially with the anonymizing properties of things like Tor and using the dark web. That being said, most of these groups do tend to advertise, which we'll get onto a bit later, but they do tend to advertise on Russian language cybercriminal forums. So even though a lot of their output is in English on their sort of extortion sites, their kind of victim shaming sites, Russian language in the forums when they're communicating is widely seen. Jim, if you want to get onto whether that even matters at all, feel free.
Well, it obviously does matter to some people, but I'd say for the majority of people working in enterprise, the value of attribution isn't that high. You really want to know how someone is doing something and whether they're targeting you or whether you are likely to be a victim. The how helps you defend against it, and the are you likely to be a victim? Especially, I mean, when you're talking financially motivated, everyone's on the table for being a victim, right? But you want to know, how do I need to defend against things, and what alerts do I need to prioritize? Whether that's Russian backed, whether that's Chinese backed, whether that's North Korea, whether that's from your own government, like, it's how people do things and when that might happen, and how you work around your defenses is more important than attributing this to people. Where it does obviously matter for attribution is where you start looking at government or law enforcement, people who might want to impose sanctions or all those other things. That's where attribution really matters. But for everyone else, it's cool to talk about, but I mean, it doesn't really add much value from the defender's perspective. I mean, that's my take on it.
There's more important things at the end of the day. No, that makes sense. Louise, you beautifully brought us onto the topic of, I guess, some of the ways that ransomware groups use the dark web. So you mentioned leak sites and hacking forums. Let's start with leak sites, I guess. So what are we talking about when we talk about a ransomware leak site? What do they look like? Are they all the same? Like, do all ransomware groups use them? That's 4 questions for you to answer.
I will do my best to unravel those in a semi-coherent manner. Okay, so leak sites, also known as ransomware blogs, extortion sites, name and shame sites, there's all manner of monikers for them, are a crucial part of that double extortion model that Jim was talking about. The way that I sort of see it told is, initially, obviously, people would have all of their files encrypted, or businesses would have all of their files encrypted, and they would feel compelled to pay the ransom in order to get those files back. As this became more of a sort of known risk of operation, and companies and individuals started keeping more up-to-date system backups, the sort of threat of encryption on its own became a bit less effective at inducing a ransom payment, because you could just restore from your backups with sort of a minimal loss of data. So the way that I like to kind of imagine it is the cyber criminals were sitting there thinking, well, we've already got access to these guys' network, so we're kind of wasting it by just scrambling all the data and then expecting that to be enough. If we've already got this foothold in here, would we be able to steal some of that data as well? And then the benefit of that is kind of twofold. You get the greater incentive for the victim to pay, lest all of their confidential, client or customer data be leaked, which is more of a big deal nowadays as well, I feel, with the kind of rise of GDPR and other kind of data privacy sort of regulations coming into force. The second benefit of doing that as kind of a fail-safe is that even if you double extort someone and they refuse to pay, you have a chance of an additional income stream if you were able to sell that data or auction it off, which a lot of these ransomware as a service gangs do.
The double extortion point, I think, is really the main one. So that idea of like, just not having backups is enough. And I think it's a great example of how cybercrime and cybersecurity are always in competition. I think I wrote a lot of stuff about how basically the response to ransomware was to have great backups. All of that is now redundant because, as you say, they found a way to extort even if you had backups. So it's really interesting. And I think so on that and the additional revenue stream thing. So it comes back to, I guess, the point we're making of like money is the game, and they're going to find every way to make money they can. And I think personally, I've been quite shocked by some of the leak sites you've shown me, Louise. I'm thinking of LockBits in particular, because they have those kind of different payment options of if you're the victim, you can pay to stop the ransomware group doing what they're doing, I guess. But they also have buyer options. That's not speaking out of turn, isn't it? That's right. So if the cyber criminals get there first and they're willing to pay the higher price, then you know the victim is kind of working against the clock on that one.
Yeah, LockBit has 3 kind of payment tiers. I think their site is quite mature. They've got I think there's one that you can pay as the victim to sort of add another 24 hours to the clock if you need more time to kind of negotiate or deliberate on what you're going to do. There's one to destroy the data. I'm doing air quotes right now because obviously you never really know for certain whether that data is really gone. And the third one, would be for a buyer, an interested third party that wants to purchase that data. So some sites, to get onto your sort of question about do they all look the same, there is quite a lot of variation in leak sites. Some of them, like LockBits, are quite matured and they've got a really nice UI, lots of different payment options, and a different kind of chain of how they work through this data. So they will typically post the victim, and then there's a certain amount of time before they decide that negotiations are no longer working or never took place and will leak or sell the data. Some ransomware gangs will only post the victim on there once negotiations have failed, and they might just post the data up for free for anyone to get, almost sort of like a giving back to the community kind of action, and gets them more attention and more sort of publicity in the mainstream news. I mean, we should note there's also ransomware gangs that don't really post on the dark web at all. Like, they might have a presence on the forums but not a leak site, or vice versa. They might have a very basic leak site but not really be active on the forums. So there is a real sort of diversity in the kind of public personas of these operations. I did make a note that the leak sites are where you get some of the best statements from these gangs. I've put e.g. Conti Costa Rica incident because they were, Conti, for those that are unaware, was like the biggest ransomware operation up until early 2022, I think. And they kind of went into a tailspin in their final few months of attacking the government of Costa Rica, encrypted a load of their government systems, and were just sort of posting really crazy stuff, for lack of a better word, on their leak site, updating it multiple times per day, denying allegations that they were actually another group as well that had recently come about called Black Basta. I think they called them kids specifically. Yeah, you get a lot of sort of drama on those.
That's quite interesting. But from the outside, it sounds, one, that the leak sites actually fulfill quite a few functions. So it's, like you say, this kind of shaming aspect. There's almost kind of an e-commerce aspect of selling data. Like you said, there's kind of a giving back to the community stuff of giving away data, a comms platform. I guess the sense I get of it is being very organized. Do you think it's fair to say that the groups that, like you say, not all groups have leak sites. The ones that do, are these the kind of more organized, sophisticated groups, and maybe the smaller ones are using Telegram and other methods? I know it's quite hard for us to say, but your sense of how sophisticated these groups are, that, the LockBits, the Contis, the Blackbusters or Ava's Lockers of the world, are they on the relatively high end of cyber criminality?
I think, again, there's a range. Just because you've got a nice site or a good web designer doesn't necessarily mean that you're sophisticated. And also, a lot of these sites, I'm pretty sure they allow the affiliates to kind of upload their victims directly, which can lead to sort of a lack of consistency in the quality of their posts, which is an interesting kind of side effect of that specialization and that kind of division of labor in the sort of ransomware world.
I was just going to say, I think maybe it doesn't look at it from the sophistication of the attack. Like, the attack stuff that we see will change depending on the affiliate and if they're following the playbooks and all that kind of stuff. I think what it does show you is a sophistication in the business model that they have. If they are going down the route of, and a lot of these groups, I don't know if we're going to get to this later on, but a lot of the groups, they will have like HR, they will have dedicated people who will put pressure on people to pay, not just through potentially leaking data, but doing phone calls and stuff. But if you look at those sites, they're decent web developers employed as well, and you have HR departments and you have managers and a whole bunch of different stuff. And I think you can't draw a conclusion that the sophistication of the business itself leads to a higher sophistication of the attack, although that often is the case. But what we're seeing and what we're looking at on the dark web side of things is that sophistication of the business model, and they need to be well-rounded in all areas, and they're putting investment into doing it. They've obviously got the money to do it, and they see that there's decent investment in there, because the whole reason double extortion works is if there are enough people can get to the site to have a look at the details around it, and hopefully from their perspective, hopefully the media gets there. So they want to have something that's well represented, and get fans all around the world tattooing LockBit tattoos on themselves and all that kind of stuff. But that's the point I'm trying to make. Is
you have to explain the tattooing LockBit thing now.
I can't remember what the offer was, but there was a spate of people posting pictures once they had the LockBit tattooed on themselves, and I can't remember.
I think he was offering, he being LockBit Sup, which is kind of like the forum's mouthpiece for LockBit Gang. He was offering people like $1,000 maybe if they got inked with the LockBit logo.
Just another weird thing that happens on the dark web. I think we've talked around affiliates quite a lot, so I think I just want to kind of explicitly bring this into the conversation now. So what we're talking about here is ransomware as a service. And Jim, you mentioned kind of ransomware groups having affiliates and having playbooks. Maybe do you mind just kind of how does the affiliate model work, and why has this become a new trend in ransomware?
Your ransomware groups are usually named around a variant of ransomware. So like a computer virus that its purpose is to encrypt files, to ship files elsewhere, to handle all the key management. So when you encrypt something, how do we get the keys off the system in a secure way that doesn't leave those keys on the system so that people can decrypt stuff themselves? That's where we name the groups after it. You have to have a fair amount of resource go into developing something along those lines. I mean, you can develop a ransomware script. A lot of people could develop a ransomware script quite quickly, but to have something that is robust enough to evade antivirus, to do whatever it needs to do, and to encrypt things quickly takes some work. So if your groups are developing the capability to do that, that doesn't necessarily mean they're specialized in being able to navigate through a network, identify where all the key files are, go after the systems that need encrypting. The idea of affiliates is that the ransomware group themselves will put the effort into developing that capability, and then they will allow other people to come in and use that capability against victims. And this is where the affiliates come in. They sometimes call them pen testers because they try to have this, I don't even know if it's like necessarily intended, but they want to have this idea that they are legitimate. They are just doing pen tests, and they might not have been asked to do that pen test, but they will prove that you have vulnerabilities, and you paying the ransom is just a return for the services they've offered. And that's where these affiliates come in. So they recruit affiliates, they have affiliates on there. When the affiliates sign up for things, if they are maybe less mature affiliates who don't exactly know what it is that they want to do when they land on a system. They have playbooks which instruct them on what commands to run to understand where in an environment you are, what level access you have, where you want to move to next, and all those kind of things. So they'll walk through those playbooks in order to detonate the ransomware in the right place.
It's quite a major evolution of the way ransomware groups operate, I guess. And I guess the problem for security professionals is, whereas before you would just have maybe what I'm going to call the ransomware operator, and they would go victim by victim, but maybe with limited scalability of that operation, there's now a potential that they can target multiple organizations at once because they're using these affiliates. Again, the commercial side of it for them is that they get a cut of the ransom. Yeah, but a potentially much higher yield is one way to put it of victims kind of around the world.
Yeah, from the ransomware operator or developer, like I like to think of them as the developer and the gang coordinator or whatever we want to call it, they're looking to scale. So you'll typically see that the affiliates for a single intrusion will pick up, say, 70% of whatever the ransom is that's paid, and the developers, they only get 30%. And the idea is there is kind of like a battle for the better affiliates between the ransomware groups, offering different terms of how much they'll get paid. So they do fight for the affiliates. But it is that scale side of things. They can deal with 30% cut of every single ransom. If they're looking at 100, 200 ransoms a year, they're going to get more money out of it doing that way than going after what they could handle themselves, maybe sort of 10 a year.
So like the whole tech world, ransomware groups are also competing for tech talent.
Yeah. It's a never-ending problem, dude.
Adds up. And I think it's a really important point, because a lot of the discussions I've had with you, Louise, when we're talking about, so you mentioned, Jim, that most ransomware groups are known by the encryptor they use, but the affiliates can jump between groups. So we often have circumstances where, it might be the same actor, who one day works for one group and the next day works for the other. It's slightly more complicated than I think often the media gives it credit for. It's not quite like there's one ransomware gang over here and they only attack these kind of organizations and there's another gang over there. Often there's a lot of crossover, or at least that's how it feels to me. I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Louise.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like Jim said, most of the developers or kind of operational core of these ransomware as a service offerings are fighting to get the best talent. And yeah, there's definitely cases of well-known forum personas that have hopped between multiple different groups. A kind of infamous actor, Wazawaka, I think he's currently on like the FBI most wanted list, but he's actually done interviews with places like the Recorded Futures kind of press outlet, and has stated which groups he's worked for as a pen tester or a initial access kind of employee. And that included like Hive, I think LockBit is also suspected to have run the Babook ransomware kind of syndicate. So yeah, it's definitely, it makes sense from like, it's just a job kind of perspective. Job hoppers tend to make more money. So why wouldn't you sort of bounce around to wherever's got the best deals and the best sort of split of the ransomware payment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could jump into. I think we could do a whole separate podcast on how ransomware groups talk to the media, because I just find that very fascinating. But I'm gonna jump slightly or sidestep slightly to, I guess, kind of the second way you said that ransomware groups use the dark web, which is hacking forums. So do they find these affiliates from the hacking forums? Is that part of it, or are they using the hacking forums for other things?
Yeah, so the forums are used by these sort of developers as a kind of recruitment pool. It's not always the case. Some operators do like to go a bit more of a kind of closed group model, where they might reach out to known sort of entities directly and recruit them. Obviously, we can't really see that, but it is probably the case. A lot of people don't like to do their business too out in the open. That being said, if you're maybe a new group, you're not as well known, you don't have as much reputation or kind of a social circle on the forums, then it would be more advantageous to put a public post out there and kind of field new recruits, usually, for the pen testing role. Sometimes they'll recruit for developers also to kind of maintain and write the new versions of the encryptors, which is another thing. It's rarely the case now that a sort of ransomware payload is released and then it just stays the same. Obviously, there's numerous companies and law enforcement agencies working on decryptors and to kind of find a way to get people their files back without having to pay criminals. And this partially has kind of motivated gangs to keep releasing new versions of their encryptors. LockBit, again, is a good example. Also groups like Alpha V, aka Black Cat, they've had a couple versions out. So that was a very long-winded way of saying that also recruit developers to keep the ransomware kind of fresh and up to date. Quite often looking for people with skills in Golang or Rust, both pretty popular for writing ransomware code. But yeah, the other kind of use of the forums is honestly a lot of arguments, a lot of beefing between different ransomware gangs, a lot of grievance airing as well, maybe from affiliates that are dissatisfied, and then maybe the ransomware sort of PR spokesperson will come back and sort of list off all of their inadequacies as an employee and why they were booted out of the gang and why no one should ever work with them again. Yeah, like where a lot of the work that people do on the dark web is inherently illegal. There's not a lot of sort of official kind of structure or recourse you can go through, so it is all based on sort of honor and reputation and what your peers think of you. So that can be really damaging if like the PR spokesperson of a big ransomware crew says, hey, don't work with this guy, he can't be trusted. So yeah, you can gain a lot of interesting intelligence from those kind of conversations.
I find this fascinating. And it's just that thing of, so you describe them as their PR spokesperson. So you mentioned LockBit stuff earlier. That's the PR persona, I guess, of the LockBit group. I think it might be shocking to some people listening that they operate, in this way, literally with a kind of comms person.
I should caveat that's how we characterize it. But again, no one really knows for sure. LockBit could just be one guy. Like that PR account could also be the person that's writing the malware. I keep saying guy as well. It could be one girl.
Yeah, it's a great point. I guess what I'm driving at is that they are operating in some ways, and this comes to the nature of the dark web, I guess, in some ways quite publicly. I think people would be shocked at that. They're not necessarily hiding what they're doing on these hacking groups. I mean, how do they stay anonymous? How do they not get this used against them by security teams, law enforcement? How are they able to operate in this kind of in the wild?
Good question. I think this sort of relates to kind of ransomware as a whole and how it's different in nature to other types of malware. Obviously, other types of malware do still get advertised on the dark web, but if we get down to like what the purposes of other types of malware versus ransomware are, you might have like an info stealer that wants to steal passwords, turning a victim's machine into a proxy or making it part of a botnet, installing like a crypto miner on that. All of these types of malware typically don't want to be noticed, because if they get noticed, that means that you're going to find a way to get rid of them. Ransomware, on the flip side, like the whole purpose is to extort the victim. Obviously, it doesn't want to be noticed before it's been executed, but once it has been executed, the whole point is that it wants to be seen and heard and taken notice of. Again, whereas other types of malware, such as like a cryptojacker or turning a victim's machine into a botnet, wants to use the machine's resources in order to make money. Ransomware uses the kind of immobilization of that machine as a sort of bargaining chip to then directly extort funds out of the victim. So that kind of difference in purpose, I guess, also feeds into the way that ransomware operators and their sort of PR personas, I guess, operate online. It's sort of the old adage of any publicity is good publicity. I think that's why they don't mind arguing with each other in forum threads either, because it's getting their name out there. In terms of staying anonymous, operational security is sort of the name of the game. It's on the forefront of their minds, also known as OPSEC for short. So that's just pretty basic stuff like using Tor, using secure communications, not posting your full name and address online. Pretty simple stuff. I mean, people do slip up on it occasionally, or get kind of their previous activity on forums correlated with their new activity and doxed and things like that. But there is also, if you want to veer into that kind of attribution territory, which can get a bit dicey. Let's say at least some ransomware gangs or ransomware operators, affiliates, are operating within the Russian Federation. It goes back to that sort of turning a blind eye. There's only so much that foreign law enforcement agencies can do.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in and explain. So doxing is unmasking somebody's actual identification. So if someone's operating under an alias, that is kind of exposing who they actually really are to other people on the dark web and potentially, law enforcement. As well as what you said, Louise, about OPSEC and things, using the dark web itself offers some degree of protection to, I guess, the operators or the affiliates and the people interacting with them. There's a reason they're not operating on the clear web. And in other podcast episodes, you can find out all about how the dark web works and the kind of protection that offers. So I won't go into too much detail here. But I guess just as we kind of move towards wrapping up, I do often think of this as a bit of a paradox with ransomware operators in particular, because like you say, Louise, they don't want to be identified in a lot of ways because it would be bad from a law enforcement perspective. But in other ways, the nature of what they do means they have to be quite public. And I said on the outset of this podcast episode that it offers an opportunity to cybersecurity professionals and law enforcement. Jim, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that. What can we learn about ransomware operators from, or ransomware groups, or by monitoring the dark web?
Yeah, I mean, if you can understand how people are getting access, then you can start to monitor for where that access might be sold. So if you take that like initial access broker sort of supply chain view of things, initial access broker might not want to be part of ransomware at all. All they're trying to do is get initial access, that foothold into a company that they're trying to sell. So they're doing this over and over and over again. If you can understand from previous reporting or whatever other sources you have that these ransomware groups or this ransomware group focuses on using initial access brokers to start with, then you can start monitoring for initial access broker posts and say, are we being targeted, or does this post look like it could be us? You can start doing hunts and whatever off the back of that to look for signs of someone being inside of your environment based off of the information that's from those initial access broker posts. You want to be able to take as much data as you can to inform your defenses. Like I said right up at the top, attribution isn't where most of us are at. Law enforcement and governments, absolutely, that should be an attribution thing. But from people who are trying to defend themselves against this stuff, attribution doesn't help us in that. When we are trying to look for true attribution, so true attribution being the person behind it, we can attribute activities to a specific group, and that will help us, right? Because each of these different ransomware groups and ransomware operators and different playbooks that they have will go about doing things in different ways, and we can learn from that to make sure our defenses are intact, make sure our detections are up to speed with this kind of stuff, so that if we do pick up a detection, we know that a certain TTP followed by another TTP is indicative of it being this group. Then we can make some educated guesses as to where they're going next to try and get ahead of them before they manage to encrypt all your files or exfiltrate all your data. And dark web is another one of those sources that you can use for it. You can see if there are any tensions. You can see, especially when you start looking at leaks, and the Conti leaks spring to mind, you can look for indicators of how people go about it based off their conversations and start to role play what that might look like inside of your environment, start to tabletop exercise, those kind of things. It's another data collection that's going to help you with your intel requirements to go and do some really cool stuff and help your other defenders.
Brilliant. We've spoken a little bit about law enforcement, but I guess there are also examples of where law enforcement have attributed attacks to particular individuals, and there are numerous examples of kind of takedowns or crackdowns on people. People have been arrested.
Absolutely. And like Lou said, from the attribution side of things, it's going to be multiple data sources used, dark web being one of them. If people are giving away any indicators of where they are, if they're talking about trying to buy something in a certain area, the dark web isn't just used for threat actors to help further their bad activities, but if they have needs when they are in a town that they don't know about, they might turn to that town or turn to the dark web to ask for advice. Like, think of it like TripAdvisor in some instances as well. There are clues for who is asking for what and where they might be located, which then helps law enforcement go, okay, well, now I need collection in that area, and then they can follow those sort of things on. Crypto is becoming a big one as well, tracking crypto things, and you might not know who has what wallet until you go onto the dark web, and then you can put a persona to a wallet, use that wallet to get into crypto, use that crypto, follow the chain through and get to an exchange, and then you can go subpoena records for that exchange to find out the who behind it all. So it is used both from a law enforcement and a non-law enforcement perspective, one to inform defenses, or two to look for those clues that are going to help you with that attribution if you need to do attribution.
Yeah, I guess these days it's not as easy as just following where the checks are being posted to. But
no, that's brought it full circle as well, dude.
Yeah, that brought it full circle. And with that, I'm going to draw a line under this episode. We could talk for a long time about ransomware, but we have to stop somewhere. So thank you for listening to this episode of The Dark Dive, and a big thank you to Jim and Louise for joining me. You can follow us for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever podcast app you have on your device, and get all of the episodes now. If you'd like to get in touch with us here at Searchlight Cyber, you can find our social media accounts and email addresses in the show notes, or you can find plenty of information on our website, www.slcyber.io. But until next time, stay safe.